From the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM and Brown College at the University of Virginia, this is Circle of Willis, human stories of the science that shapes our world.
I will say that working with people who are psychopathic impressed on me how not like that most people are.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that really reinforced for me that the average person is capable of true compassion.
Welcome back to Circle of Willis. I'm your host, Jim Cohn.
And I'm Sage Tangway. So today's episode is about Abby Marsh. Can you tell me about her?
Yeah, Abigail Marsh, or Abby, as I like to call her, as most people call her, is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She's a clinical psychologist, and she has made a career out of the overlap between research on emotion, on psychopathy, and altruism.
Which I think for some people might seem like, whoa, those are two very different things. Studying why people are kind and selfless feels like a very different thing than studying, people who might kill people.
What Abby's insight was to realize something that I mentioned in the interview seems obvious in retrospect. Altruistic helping behavior, really giving of yourself selflessly, is sort of the opposite of psychopathic behavior, where you have almost complete disregard, or maybe complete disregard, for the well-being of another person.
Early on in your conversation, you ask her to recount a story of something that happened to her when she was 19 that really changed how she thought about altruism and what people do for strangers. Let's hear a little bit of that.
It was driving on I-5.
I-5 in Washington State.
That's right. The major freeway linking Seattle and Tacoma. And I was driving home, and it was late at night, and I was crossing a little bridge, big bridge actually, back into Tacoma, and my car spun out when I swerved.
Spun out?
Yeah, I swerved to avoid a dog. So I ended up in the fast lane of the freeway where my car came to a rest, and then the engine died somehow from doing all these spins. And I couldn't get the engine to turn back on again. And so I'm stranded in the fast lane of the freeway over the crest of the bridge so that the cars can't even see me until they're practically on top of me.
Oh, my God.
And there's no shoulder because it's a bridge. And it was the middle of the night. I had no phone because it was the 90s. And right now the plot would change completely. I'd be calling 911, which actually could have been worse. But anyways, and so I was sure I was going to die, and I just didn't know how long it was going to be. And this man appeared at the passenger's side window.
Appeared?
Yes. My memory is that I was furiously trying to get the car to turn back on. And what I didn't realize in the moment was that it was still in drive. And so I needed to put it back in park to get it to turn on. But
But you were freaked out.
I was freaked out. I was 19. Yeah. I thought to turn on the brights and the flashers to try to make myself more visible. And I remember having this debate about should I stay in or get out, which is worse. I have no idea. And so my memory is that, the car windows were rolled down because it was summer. And I just heard a rap on the passenger side window, which was the side near the shoulder. And I turned, and there's a man standing there who says, "You look like you could use some help." And I said, "Yes, I could." So what he'd done is he'd parked on the other side of the freeway, which must have been a split-second decision because he would have been going freeway speed when he saw me. Then he'd run across the road in the middle of the night. And then to get into my car, he had to run back into traffic again, hop in the driver's seat. I scooched into the passenger seat. And then he figured out what I had not, which was that the car was still in drive, got it turned back on, and then gunned us back across the freeway and parked behind his car. It was all over in seconds. He definitely saved my life. And then he said, he looked at me, and I'm sure it was a disaster. And he said, "You don't look so good. Can I follow you for a little bit to make sure you get home?" And I said, no, I'll be okay. And he said, "All right, you take care of yourself." And then that was that. And he was just gone.
And that stuck with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in a daze for days afterward. It changes the way you think about humans when a stranger does that for you. It's all well and good to read about strangers saving other people's lives, often some newspaper article. It's real in a way that it's only hypothetical, I think, when you read about it. It's like the difference between knowing something semantically and understanding it at a really
reading about hitting a baseball and then hitting a baseball.
Yeah, exactly.
Really different.
Exactly.
And this becomes like her origin story.
Yeah, a core memory for her.
A core starting point for her career, because she has a few questions. One of them is, why did he stop and help her? The other is, why doesn't it matter that she's a stranger? And the other is, why does she still not know even who he is? What was the payoff for him?
Yeah.
These are questions that have long plagued biology, because Darwin was like freaked out by this possibility. It didn't seem to fit with the theory of evolution, and it's spun off all kinds of theories about that. But what Abby's really done is center this series of questions within psychology and neuroscience and really try to pursue them. But she had to study examples of that kind of selfless behavior. And in a fascinating way, what that meant was that she had to study examples of behavior that was completely callous to the feelings and well-being and safety of others.
Let's take a listen to your conversation.
You actually grew up in Tacoma.
Well, where I grew up was actually University Place, which at the time
University Place? What's that?
It's a town of 30,000 people, not even
I've
in
never even
Tacoma.
heard of it.
Exactly. It doesn't
What
have
the
a
hell?
university in it. It's the most
or
ridiculous
is
name.
it even a place?
Yeah, it's
Like
a
the
very
most
cute little place.
misnamed place.
It's a ridiculous. I mean, there have been multiple attempts to try to change the name to have
It's like
something
Turtle
to
Bay,
do.
New York.
Yeah.
There's no turtles and no bay.
Exactly. It was when we moved there in 1980, I think. It was right after St. Helens exploded. We just missed that.
Yeah.
It was very rural, full of apple orchards and horse pastures, and there was even a sign in the Safeway parking lot that said "No horses in the parking lot." And you'd see people, riding their horses to places. It was like we had moved to the west.
Who was the celebrity that grew up near?
Ted Bundy.
Oh, yes.
I guess celebrity is one word for it.
Ted Bundy.
Yeah, I mapped it out.
Prescient.
Yeah, 3 miles away.
3 miles away.
And if my house was here, and Ted's was here, between 3 and 4 miles away, and Kent Keel's was here.
Kent Keel.
Yeah, Kent Keel and I grew up in the
Another
same neighborhood.
celebrity.
Although we didn't.
Maybe not a celebrity. Maybe we're overstating it.
Ken would be delighted to have you call him a celebrity.
Yeah, I bet he would.
So he and I grew up in the same neighborhood, actually, but he's enough older than me.
So 2 of the world's most gifted psychopathy researchers lived just down the road from Ted Bundy growing
It's
up.
no accident, right? I mean, everybody in
not be.
town was obsessed with him. It was horrifying to know that this person had grown up in our town and nobody had any idea.
I have a sort of a Ted Bundy story too. I used to work at the Seattle Crisis Clinic.
Did you really?
Yes, I worked there for a long time, and I used to work in the same phone room that he used to work in. Yeah.
Ugh, did it have creepy vibes
and
to it?
I always feel conflicted, and you must get this all the time because you study psychopathy, right? You probably talk about psychopaths. You don't want to like glamorize or celebritize them too much, but there was this like weird Ted Bundy was here kind of thing. And
absolutely.
he used to like select his victims, some of them, through the crisis lines.
That I didn't know.
Yeah.
That's awful.
I heard that anyway. I don't know if that's actually true.
I mean, it's amazing how many people in that area have a Ted Bundy story. I went to University of Washington. I did an interview there once, and one of the clinical psych professors there was Ted Bundy's psychology professor.
Oh, yeah.
And had no idea.
No, he got a psych degree from the University of Washington.
And this guy introduced Ted to his wife and wrote him
Holy shit.
wrote him letters of recommendation for law school.
Stop it. Come on.
Nobody knew.
I can't stand it.
I know. He shoplifted at one of the Nordstroms I used to sell clothes at.
So how was Dartmouth?
Dartmouth was great. I had picked it back when people got information about colleges from big books.
Right, I
those
remember.
Barron's books and
Yeah,
things. And I went through and I earmarked all the ones that had 5 stars for academic quality.
So
and
you
then
were
I went
good.
back through and unflagged all the ones that had low quality of life ratings. So
Nice.
Chicago was out, unfortunately, and a few other very good
Yeah,
schools.
yeah.
Dartmouth obviously survived both of those decision criteria.
Did you get a psych degree?
I did. Was intending to be pre-med, like half my class, I'm sure.
Yeah. That was my intended goal as well as an undergrad.
Yeah, because you don't get much exposure to the full scope of science as a high school student.
Well, if you were pre-med, then you probably did, a lot of chemistry and bio. Did you do like the
I
bio
quit
series?
much faster than that. I quit 3 days or something into my first pre-med bio class.
Is that right?
And I was taking psychology at the same time.
Yeah.
Intro psych, pre-med biology.
Well,
there was no contest.
When did you finish up undergrad?
99.
99?
Mm-hmm.
And you went to graduate school you went to Harvard?
I did.
Wow.
Yeah. I think, being at Dartmouth was a good
precursor.
Yes, it is one of the
what the
less
Ivies
scary
are.
Ivies.
Who'd you work with?
I worked with Nolly and Body.
Right.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
Yeah.
What an incredible experience.
It was very cool. It was a great experience, everything about it.
And so while you're going through undergraduate and graduate school, is there anything about this experience, this story that you told us that's sort of bubbling in your consciousness at any point?
It's one of those things that in retrospect, I try not to overread the situation. I don't want to say it was I will study altruism and that was the only thing I will ever think about from that moment on. But it was clearly at the core of all the kinds of questions that I was asking.
Like what? What kinds of questions were you asking right away?
Well, for my undergraduate thesis, I'm interested in facial expressions, and I was working with my wonderful undergrad advisor, Bob Clack, who studied many things having to do with how we perceive faces. And I remember just having this moment. I had been doing a paper on how we perceive differences in facial age. So what are things that cue us to the age of somebody's face? So all the way from a face that's babyish to one that looks old.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I was simultaneously doing a research project with Bob Clack on facial expressions. And so as I was writing this paper on facial babyishness and trying to get people to look fearful in these photos I was taking, it suddenly hit me that, hey, when I'm trying to get people to look fearful, I'm actually trying to get them to look more babyish. And isn't that interesting? Because we know that babyish faces are appeasing. And they signal, don't hurt me. Please help me. I need help. I'm weak and vulnerable.
I have never thought of it that way.
You want to keep reading my book. That's at the core of all of it. And it was my undergrad thesis idea. And I remember coming to Bob with it. And I said, I think fearful expressions, came to look the way they do because they look babyish. And so they signal that you were vulnerable and you need help. And they elicit altruistic impulses from people just the way babies do. And he's like, that's the most harebrained idea I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Because he's great.
It's awesome.
Anyways, but to his great credit, because he's a wonderful scientist, and I have always thought of him as sort of a wonderful model for how to be a scientist, just curious and willing to consider almost anything. He let me run some studies to get the preliminary data on that question. So it was, that was an altruism question right from the beginning.
It's very foundational when I think about what follows in your career, your sort of literature.
Yeah, no, so here I am, how many years later, still looking at questions related to my undergrad thesis.
One of the things I always found so satisfying about a lot of discussions about emotions was that I've often felt like sort of the interpersonal functions were, I couldn't quite get a handle on them from a lot of the dominant theories. It was like, well, it's just expressing.
Right.
It's just expressing, right? It's not compelling, sort of social dynamics in any way.
Well, I think it's because animal behavior has always been my other main interest. In fact, the study in my Psych 1 textbook that I flagged as the one that sort of made me realize you can be a psychology researcher for a living, and wouldn't that be cool, was a study on teaching primate sign language. So I love like animal behavior. Yeah, if Dartmouth had a primate research program, I surely would have ended up doing that.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff.
Yeah, and if you have a dog or if you're familiar with animal behavior in general, you know that that's exactly how animals use fear and submission cues, is to ward off attack or to elicit aid. And so I think we sometimes see other animals' behavior more clearly than we see our own. We don't come to it with quite as many assumptions. And I think it is a really useful lens for understanding human behavior.
So you probably didn't know this at the time, but you were really starting to build a program almost right from the beginning.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, again, certainly unwittingly.
Nobody knows that, right? Yeah, unwittingly, right?
Yeah.
Nobody really realizes that. When does the study of psychopathic behavior start arriving on the scene?
So I was in the process of doing my dissertation. I had actually been going to look at gender differences, I think. I was something to do with high and low power people, and are they better or worse at recognizing other people's
Fear
emotions?
faces,
Yeah, it turns
maybe?
out they're not big gender differences in emotion accuracy. I was also looking at altruism in this series of studies and found this whopping correlation between how accurately people recognize fearful expressions and only fearful expressions and how altruistically they behaved in this unrelated paradigm. Huge, I mean, like a correlation of, I think it was like 0.6 or something. It was insane, right? Recognizing fear accurately was highly correlated with whether you were kinder in this paradigm versus not. And so then we ran the study again with tighter controls and found exactly the same pattern, and found that fear recognition predicted behaving kindly in this paradigm better than self-reported empathy, better than gender, better than mood. And then we ran a Katie Banks type paradigm where people had the opportunity to give money or volunteer time to help this stranger they heard about in the lab. It was sort of a gold standard altruism task. And again, found that recognizing fear was actually a better predictor of donating money than even the empathy inducement that we used, which also worked. But recognizing fear was this really strong predictor.
Isn't that amazing?
And so all this time, it had been really difficult to find any good individual difference variables that predicted altruism. And it seemed to be mainly about situational variables. And everybody knew that there was variation in how people behaved in the lab, but finding predictors of individual differences was really hard. And looks like fearful expression recognition as a predictor. And so this seemed really weird. And it was included in some review of most unintuitive findings in social psychology of that year or something.
Yeah.
Until I came upon James Blair's work on psychopathy. And people who were psychopathic, it turns out, are really bad at recognizing fearful expressions, and predominantly fearful expressions. And there's been a couple meta-analyses on that now.
So there's
really
starting to be convergence.
Yeah, and I'm like,
right
hey,
Isn't
wait
that
a minute.
Amazing.
Love
How
it when that
totally
happens.
different literatures. You know, this is one of the things that I think suggests a more reliable, robust finding. You know, converging from completely different starting places.
Exactly.
Right?
So you have those like developmental psych and clinical psych and cognitive psych research on psychopathy, and it dovetailed really nicely with what I'd been finding in my social psych studies in the lab.
So what did you think about that at the time?
I was trying to make it all make sense. Actually, a philosopher named Sean Nichols had this brilliant paper on the concern mechanism that James had cited quite a bit, and that led me to it. And that actually had the best explanation of it at the time, which was, in that period, a lot of people believed that altruism was about good theory of mind, really high-level cognitive abilities to sort of imagine another person's complex, high-level mental states. And Nichols, looking at psychopathy and autism and other clinical conditions and developmentally, said that's ridiculous. Clearly not. There's no evidence that that's true. The only thing that seems to be required to feel concern for other people's well-being, which is the state that directly motivates altruism, is just the ability to tell when they're in distress. You know, to tell that somebody's suffering or experiencing fear. That seems to set it off. Now, how? He didn't know. He's a philosopher.
You start having to peel the page back on what human nature even is, right? Because why should just awareness of a thing compel a behavior? It's pretty animal.
Yeah. Well, and again, it comes back to this interesting question about knowledge, right?
Yeah,
it's not about semantic knowledge. It's about some much deeper understanding of what that person is feeling.
Right.
Putting these two constructs together is the ability to detect other people's acute distress and the desire to care for other people's well-being.
Yeah.
Somehow those two things are connected. They're not the same phenomenon. One is empathy, really, in a very low level. It drives me crazy when empathy gets conflated with self-reported empathy, because that's not the same thing.
Oh,
I think that
expand on that. That's interesting.
Right. So a lot of the time, and especially in the empathy wars, you know, people will
The empathy wars.
Is empathy a good thing or a bad thing?
Paul Bloom and all that.
Right, exactly. Empathy gets conflated with self-reported empathy, right? Your empathy gets boiled down to how you respond on like the IRI, the self-report empathy form. Self-reported empathy, you know, it has all the weaknesses of other self-report measures, and probably more than some, because it's such a socially desirable construct.
Yeah.
And I'm not always convinced that people are fully aware of their own levels of empathy and care compared to other people. But I would argue that the ability to accurately detect when somebody else is in distress is, if anything, a more true form of empathy right? You are understanding somebody else's emotional state. It seems to be more strongly predictive of behavior, for example, than self-reported empathy.
Well, and the stakes are high too. If someone's in distress, that's an important thing to know.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of a strong test, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, we know that from the bystander literature,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That's one of the
right.
strong predictors of helping is whether
Yeah.
you can just figure out that the person is in
Needs
distress or if you're
Yeah.
confused. Then, as tremendous luck would have it, was as I was looking for a postdoc,
Yep.
my good friend and colleague Tali Wheatley was at the NIH
Oh,
and
yeah.
mentioned there's somebody who came to NIH recently from University College London. It wasn't even on any of his papers yet, so I had no idea that he was at NIH. And she says he does research on psychopathy. And of course, this was the R.J.R. Blair that I had been citing
yes.
in all
Oh
of my
my God,
dissertation
of
papers. He
course.
was the single most cited person in my dissertation.
Wow.
And she said, well, he's at NIH now. He's doing research and he's looking for a
Holy
postdoc.
shit.
I said, he is? I said, James Blair? That's not R.J.R. Blair, is it? And it was. And incredibly good fortune
That
in
is
every
pretty
sense.
lucky.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
is pretty lucky.
Incredibly
I'm gonna call
lucky.
that lucky.
So
Yeah.
much luck.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So you go to NIH.
Mm-hmm.
Is this where you start down the road of learning about brain imaging?
Yes, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to go there.
Of course, yeah, sure.
Because again, back in 2004.
This is 04, 05.
Yeah,
that,
Harvard had no
it's-
magnet.
Well, and this is when I started learning neuroimaging too. It was sort of like, it was crescendoing a little bit about that time because it had been going on. And, you were still seeing paper after paper in Science and Nature with neuroimaging data. And it
Right,
was
with
like,
samples of
whoa,
15
but
people.
that's what I did. And,
Me too. Yeah.
So exciting.
Yeah, no, it was incredible. I mean, it was just an amazing opportunity. So I wanted to come to NIH for a number of reasons. I was getting married, and my husband was a Marine at the time, and DC is a great place for people
Marines.
with military backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to get into neuroimaging, and because Harvard had no magnet at the time, I mean, at that period of time, the only way to get into scanning was to know somebody
Right.
at MGH who had, a couple slots per week at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday or something. And it was really
That's
difficult.
the other thing about that time. I don't think people really realize how hard it was to break in
Incredibly hard.
to neuroimaging. You had to be, there were a few places, right? It certainly wasn't all over the place like it is now.
No, And so I got to NIH, took a crash course in everything brain. I'd taken neuroanatomy and psychophysiology. I had some, and I'd even taken an fMRI course. But of course, again, it's the difference between knowing about it in a book and actually doing it. Huge difference.
Oh, my God.
And I just remember the feeling of
Jesus.
thinking I was, here I had my PhD and I felt like I was so sharp. And then I get to NIH and I felt like the biggest dummy. There were no social
Lord
psychologists
help me.
there.
Yeah,
These
I know.
were physicians and neuroscience PhDs and things. I got to do research doing fMRI studies with the population he was working with at the time, which was kids who have psychopathic traits.
What was that like for you?
It was...
Did you meet these kids? You must have met with these kids?
I really, really, really enjoyed and still do enjoy working with them and their families. I value their time and their helping us, and I find it just really interesting to talk to people who are high in these callous, unemotional traits who who do things and feel things that just are fairly foreign to the rest of us. And so our main goal was to do brain scans on them.
Okay.
So we wanted to test how their brains are responding to these facial expressions.
So what did you find?
So we recruited, I think it was 12 children with psychopathic traits, which again at the time was
tough to do.
Oh my gosh. I mean,
Tough
years
to
it took to recruit that
yeah.
sample. And every child was subject to probably 6 or 7 hours of screening and testing before we scanned them.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And we compared them to 12 kids with ADHD and 12 healthy kids who had no clinical issues as they looked at fearful and angry and neutral facial expressions. And we found, exactly as we hypothesized, that the psychopathic children showed, on average, no amygdala response at all to the fearful expressions, whereas both the healthy kids and the kids with ADHD showed the pattern you find pretty reliably, which is an elevated amygdala response.
Yeah.
And then no similar pattern in response to anger.
It's pretty compelling that you see this fairly specific deficit.
I agree. I
should say what that is. That there's this deficit in recognizing fear faces, but not so much anger, not joy, not sad.
Yeah.
A little bit was sad, right? As I recall.
Sometimes
Little
sad,
bit,
yeah.
sometimes
I don't
sad.
get sadness. I'm the first to admit it. It sort of trails along with fear sometimes, but not as reliably.
Yeah.
And it has something.
It has similar functional qualities.
It does,
probably,
right?
yeah.
Sadness is such an interesting emotion. In some ways, I think it's more complex than fear.
Right.
Fear is quite simple.
Yeah.
And we have good animal models of it, and
Yep.
it doesn't need a lot of brain
So have
software.
you thought about how some of this specificity sort of squares with?
I have. I mean, I wrote a paper on, how we can understand emotions from studying psychopathy. Because, I came to this particular question of basic emotions versus not versus our emotional expressions, readouts, or social communication devices with no real dog in the fight. I had good grounding in the facial expression literature, both from undergrad and graduate work. Now, Nalini and one of my grad school colleagues, Hilary Anger Elfenbein, did a nice meta-analysis looking at all of the cross-cultural work on emotion recognition at the time that was in Psych Bull, and found a huge effect for recognition of, quote, basic emotions above chance across cultures. And, they looked at it every which way, because, of course, there were, I'm sure, reviewers on that paper who were not happy.
Yes.
And tested the finding in so many ways. And so, to me, that has always remained the body of work that is most consistent with the idea that there's some germ of something that is universal and innate about emotional expressions like fear.
I've definitely always, the hardest part for me in the debate has always been the facial expressions.
Yeah.
I'm not too worried about the universal physiological, under the skin kind of, but signal is public. So there's lots of opportunity for feedback and hence selection, right? So I've always wondered more about facial expressions. And your work suggests to me, it's one of the many lines of work that suggests to me that there's really something pretty substantial signal-wise about these different facial expressions that we kind of refer to as basic or basic-ish.
Yeah, that's what I've come to think, is that it's really hard to explain why there would be this consistent relationship between psychopathy and difficulty recognizing fear, and pretty clearly mostly fear, without there being something sort of essential, whatever it is that's generating that expression and that we as perceivers recognize as fear.
So these kids had, on average, smaller amygdala.
We have found since then that they do have smaller amygdalas. We know that adult psychopaths have, and I really shouldn't use the word psychopath about adults either. I've come to believe we should say people with psychopathy the same way we say it about any other clinical condition. In any case, we know that adults who are psychopathic have smaller amygdalas than healthy adults. The findings with kids have been a little more all over the map, but more recently it looks like.
Well, you have that one story. You have some story about there was a kid that you saw that you thought was classic.
So this was a boy. He was one of the first kids that we brought in for the psychopathy study, and we had done the standard PCL interview with him to see if he had psychopathic traits. We did not have good enough background information on him, which is a great reminder, again, of some weaknesses of self-report, because when we asked him, so tell us about yourself, he told us about committing every crime in the book. I mean, it was probably, 10 categories of crimes
12?
he committed. No, I think he was 14.
14.
That was the age of most of the kids we got.
Yeah.
And he had shot people, and he'd been shot, and he stole stuff and tried drugs and beat people up, and you name the thing that one could do as a 14-year-old boy in the DC area, he'd done it. And he said he had no empathy, no remorse for any of it. He was tough. He was pretty cold. And his mom had some pretty serious mental illness issues herself, and so we had to talk to his aunt instead to get collateral information, and we didn't have enough.
Yeah.
Looking back, it was clear. But anyways, he did qualify for our study as having, I think, he had conduct disorder and elevated psychopathic traits. So we brought him in for a scan. And we did the thing we always do when we bring a kid in for a scan. We do the metal check, and then we just give them a description of what the scanner is and how it will work and what they'll do when they're in there. And as we're describing the scanning procedure to him, I can tell his behavior is changing. He went from his usual very assured demeanor to shifting a little bit, and he kept glancing at the scanner through the window, past our head, and just looking nervous.
He was
And
nervous.
it was really weird because we
Doesn't sound very psychopathic to me.
No, we'd scanned a number of kids at that point, and this is the first kid who had come in seeming nervous, and this includes the ADHD kids, the healthy kids, and certainly the kids who were psychopathic. None of it had seemed nervous. When we asked him if he was doing okay, he said, I don't think I'm doing okay. I want my mom.
Oh,
and
buddy.
Yeah, and we said,
Now I'm sad.
Yeah, so his cousin was in the waiting room, and we brought his cousin in to hang out with him, or maybe it was his friend. His cousin's like, you okay? And he's like, yeah, I'm okay, but he wasn't, clearly. And then we're like, okay, we've, done all the preamble. It's time to go do the scan. You ready to go do the scan? And his eyes filled with tears, and he said, I don't think I can do it. He wouldn't get up. He wouldn't go towards the scanner. And we were just stunned. I mean, we hadn't seen that coming. And, again, the scary things that this kid had encountered in his real life and the way he described them did not give us any premonition this was going to happen. And he said, I'm sorry, guys. Just apologize to us. I thought I could do it, but I can't do it. I'm really sorry. And then he gave me this big hug, this big, skinny teenage hug.
Oh, stop it.
Oh, my God. And then in that moment, I just realized we had this kid all wrong. Completely. He was not at all who we thought he was. He was probably a pretty sweet kid who had a really crappy life. And I mean, really crappy. We knew that from all the discussions we'd had with him. And, I think of him a lot. You cannot diagnose psychopathy from either a genetic test or a brain scan.
So what that literally means is you could have a psychopath in the scanner and they could have a normal-sized amygdala.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we don't have anywhere near the level of granularity.
You've got sort of sensitivity, but not specificity.
Exactly. Yeah, we get very reliable mean differences between groups.
Right.
But as you know, there are both reliability and other kinds of issues with all of our measures, including the psychopathy assessments. For example, this kid that we, click, down the psychopathy checklist, he looked like he fit the bill. And then in this one moment, it was clear, whoops, we had him wrong. And kids in particular, they're developing. And so we had a number of children that we assessed early on, and it looked like they were high in psychopathy, and then they veered off, and it turned out it was some early strange manifestation of bipolar disorder, other things. So that's one reason.
I used to do clinical work a lot. I worked with at least one guy who was, you don't get diagnosed with psychopathy. You get diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and he gave me every indication that he was a psychopath for a long time. But then we started talking about his fears about the world. He said something that was the needle scratching across the record just made me stop and completely change the narrative. He's like, I lay awake afraid for my daughter. Oh. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
That's not what I expected you to say.
Well, there's this idea of secondary psychopathy, which is an alternate route to becoming very antisocial and in some senses callous as well. Although, as you've seen, there's sort of chinks in the callousness.
Yeah.
That is more likely to result from abuse, neglect, gross sort of emotional dysfunction.
Terrible life.
Yeah. So did he have conduct disorder? Did he do antisocial things? For sure. But I think the route by which he got there was different than the other children that we interviewed who grew up in these lovely families with other kids who were doing great and had no signs of obvious dysfunction or hardship in their lives, and still were torturing the animals and taking their parents' car joyriding and setting fire to things. And, that has some other origin, clearly. But can we see it in an MRI?
Maybe not.
Not perfectly, obviously.
Maybe
there's so much going on.
Right. There's so much going on. There's so many different, and there's different ways it's titrated, your life experience. And these are really cool studies. This is cool, provocative. It converges with other things. When does the idea occur to you to turn it around, to not study psychopaths, but to study, in effect, their opposite?
Well, it had always been there, right? I had been interested in altruism from the start.
Right.
One of the reasons I wanted to switch to studying psychopathy in the magnet was because of the really frustrating limitations of studying altruism in a lab. You bring people into a lab, you can't put them under actually risky situations, Lord knows. They always know they're being tested.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to get any true measures of altruism in the lab that you feel really confident in. And so I took the approach of let's do the clinical approach, study people who are lacking concern naturally as far as we can tell, try and see what's different about them. And I think it was that, right? So this approach of taking people whose behavior in the world tells us there's something unusual about them, and then bring them into the lab and see if we can see what's different about them. Right around that same time, some of my former colleagues from Harvard who had been studying face recognition came out with this really cool series of studies on super face recognizers. So, face recognition is a continuum. That once upon a time, people thought there was this weird group of people off on the end who can't recognize faces due to a disease or an accident, and everybody else is just normal. And then they're like, hey, wait a minute, actually, face recognition is a continuum. And you've got people who are very bad at recognizing faces, most of us in the middle. And then at the other end, you've got this complete continuum of people who are amazing face recognizers, freaky face recognizers. And I have to believe that those ingredients sort of spun around because I knew that psychopathy had a lot of the same components. We knew it's a continuum, the strong heritability coefficient. There's some people at the very low end of the caring continuum, as I've sort of dubbed it. And most of us in the middle, but that just begs the question, well, what's at the other end? Is there something like an anti-psychopath?
Right.
And so around 2010, I thought, well, what if we tried to get people in the lab who look the opposite of psychopaths? And I thought of heroic rescuers, of course, but it seemed a little difficult to reach out to people who are heroic rescuers. And right around the same time, I think it was Larissa McFarquhar had come out with that great New Yorker article on altruistic kidney donation. Yeah. And it struck me, hey, now that's it. It's a really good example of incredibly altruistic behavior, extraordinarily altruistic behavior. You're giving away one of your own internal organs for somebody you've never met before. And it has this beautiful parallelism with another famous psychopath from Tacoma area, the Green River Killer, who was probably the most prolific psychopath or a serial killer in U.S. history. His first serious crime that anybody knows about was stabbing a kid in the woods, just a strange kid he'd never met before, and he stabbed him right in the kidney, destroyed his kidney.
Oh, come on.
Not for no reason, just because.
Yeah.
And so I submitted a grant proposal to support the research, and Templeton very happily funded it. I mean, I was happy that they funded it.
It's such a good idea.
Thanks. And also the Positive Neuroscience Center.
Positive Neuroscience Center.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine who else would have funded that.
Well, I mean, everyone should have.
That's kind.
You got to fund good research. That's a good idea.
Thanks. I'm so glad that I've had the chance to do it because it's been just a joy to do this research, no question.
How'd you find them? How do you go about studying this population?
Well, as fantastic luck would have it, there is a professor here at Georgetown who's part of our bioethics center who is on the board of the Washington Regional Transplant Center.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he helped get me in touch with their director, and they put out some letters to I think it was maybe 10 or 12 altruistic kidney donors in this region, asking them if they'd like to participate in a study. And then there was a national listserv that we posted an ad into for one of the national kidney organizations. I think it was UNOS, the United Network on Organ Sharing. So we posted some ads, and the amazing thing about altruistic kidney donors is that they're really, really helpful. It was amazing. And I tell this in my book about I had gone down to a conference in Texas. I think it was SPSP. I didn't have a smartphone at that point, and there was for some reason, no wireless access at that conference center. And I couldn't check my email until, I think it was almost a day until I got down there. And I remember opening up my laptop, finally connecting to the wireless, and I just had been flooded with emails from altruistic kidney donors who wanted to participate in the research, which, having studied special populations in the past, I know does not happen. It's a huge slog to find people when they're rare. And altruistic kidney donors, there were maybe 2,000 of them in the country, not even. We had enough people volunteering within days to fill the study. So we flew people in from, you name the state, we probably have flown somebody in from there.
So you bring them into the lab and you run them through a similar battery?
Yeah, so we ran them through an emotion task in the magnet where we did fMRI while they looked at fearful, angry, and neutral expressions. And then we also measured their ability to recognize these expressions. And then did a ton of other stuff. I think it was 5 hours of testing that each of them went through before they were done that first time. And we've done a couple rounds now, so we've been studying them for years.
And this was after they had donated a kidney?
Yes, so they all had to have completed the donation. Yes, because there was a large number of people who volunteered to donate a kidney to a stranger.
And then at some point, I'm not going to do that.
They're like, oh boy, this is kind of a big deal. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is understandable.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, so they had all completed the donation. And we didn't know if we'd be able to get any of them. And so we had all sorts of other possibilities of who we could recruit instead.
That's wise. Yeah.
Yeah, but as it turned out, it was no trouble at all to get 20 altruistic kidney donors here.
So what'd you find?
So we found that they do look a lot like antipsychopaths.
The anti-psychopath.
Yeah, they look like the opposite of a psychopath in a number of ways. They have a stronger amygdala response to fear, again, on average. And again,
to fearful faces.
Sorry, that's right, to fearful expressions. And only fearful expressions, so we don't see this
Only,
similar.
again, with the specificity.
And then their amygdala is larger than the controls by about 8%, and only the amygdala, so we didn't find similar patterns for hippocampus. Although, interestingly, their whole brain is also bigger. So if you just look at their overall gray matter volume, I know. But even after you covariate that out, their amygdalas are larger. And they are relatively better at recognizing fearful facial expressions than controls also. But again, not other expressions, like not anger. So it's not like they're just better, more socially sensitive overall, but they're more responsive to this one particular expression that seems to be so closely linked to care, concern, altruism.
And what are they like?
I've always said, certainly about the psychopathic kids that I have studied, that if I were to line them all up mixed in with healthy kids, you'd never be able to pick out who's who. No, definitely not. I've heard psychiatrists before, and maybe you know this, refer to certain disorders as waiting room disorders, where you can tell that child has a serious disorder before you even start talking to them. And autism, severe forms of autism or severe forms of psychosis sometimes fit that bill. And that is not true for psychopathic traits. It's a pretty limited set of problems. And it's amazing how many things people who are psychopathic are not different in terms of moral reasoning and a lot of personality measures. Oh, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so initially I would have said the same was true about altruistic kidney donors, that if we mix them in with the controls, it would be difficult to tell who is who. I kind of think that that's true, although I think that maybe if you had the chance to chat with them for a few minutes, you might start to pick up on differences. It's not something I can really put my finger on very easily, but there's just a difference in the way they talk to you when you're first meeting them, which I think is really closely connected to the fact that they wanted to give away an organ to a stranger. And it's that they think about strangers differently. They don't think about strangers as, people to be kept at arm's length. And again, I don't think any of this is explicit. And the thing I want to emphasize above everything is that if you ask most altruistic kidney donors what is different about them, they will say emphatically nothing is different about them. They're just an ordinary person who happened to be in the right place with the right information at the right time.
Right kidney.
Yeah, they had a healthy kidney. Yeah. They found out what the need is for kidneys. There's nothing different about them. And so
they're wrong.
Well, and how well can any of us really ascertain ourselves that way? So I should emphasize that, while also saying that I have noticed a difference in working with them compared to the ordinary adults from the local DC community who we recruit as controls, who also, I would say on average, are pretty lovely people, because participating in psychology research that you have to come in for 5 hours of testing is kind of a pain in the neck.
Yeah,
and so anybody who's willing to do that is already a pretty nice person.
Right.
But the altruistic kidney donors are just so kind right from the get-go, and not in a sappy way. They're not martyrs. There's nothing like that. But there's this sort of openness, or just the lack of feeling like there's a barrier or something there from the get-go. Yeah. It's really nice. I really, I can't overstate what a joy it's been to do this kind of research. I mean, the interviews that we've done with them are, not really part of the data that we've written up. But I've learned so much from those interviews. And interestingly, we weren't going to do detailed interviews initially because we knew that they were altruistic kidney donors. So it's not like we had to get that from an interview. We had that from their hospital. Yeah. But I had an undergrad working in the lab, Alyssa Mrazek, actually, who said, well, let's do some videotaped interviews with them, because I would think that would be valuable. Looking back, I'm like, oh my God, thank goodness she suggested that. God. Because they've been incredible to really get to know them as people. And
I'd love to see some of those.
Absolutely.
One day.
Well, quite a few of them. Actually, I think almost everybody I've asked has signed agreement to have these interviews.
As long as it benefits the world.
Yeah, so you'd be welcome to.
So would you say that you've hit on this sort of continuum that's really pretty fundamental to how humans operate, it seems like to me?
I think so.
Because you think about what humans are as a species, and we're this hyper social, hyper cooperative. I mean, I hesitate to say hyper altruistic because that has a more specific meaning than cooperation. I mean, you can cooperate without being altruistic.
That's right.
Right.
Well, it depends on if you're asking a biologist or a psychologist.
Right.
A
biologist would say, cooperation and altruism, not the same.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that working with people who are psychopathic impressed on me how not like that most people are.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that really reinforced for me that the average person is capable of true compassion. Yeah. Because otherwise, why would we label some people psychopathic?
Well,
that's the point.
It does seem like if there's a normal curve, that the mean is going to be over in the altruistic side of the zero.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, most people are capable of true compassion, by which I mean truly caring about other people's welfare for them.
Yeah.
Thinking of it as something that is variable, looking at the two ends of the spectrum as a way of sort of understanding what the key components are of variation is really, I think, what I've been doing.
Yeah, you do talk about oxytocin a bit as well, like oxytocin sort of working hand in glove with this recognition of distress.
And this is the one effect of intranasal oxytocin that has survived meta-analyses, is it improves recognition of fear. And only fear, right? It's a killer, right?
You're killing me with this.
It's amazing. Yeah. I mean, it's clearly doing something. I think I know what it is, but we don't have any data to support it. But I think I have a reasonable.
And do you feel comfortable sort of saying what that is?
Yeah. It's in the book. There's, it's a paragraph in there that will be of no interest to anybody but actual academics who study this stuff. But it helped me to sort of put the pieces together. The paradox of altruism is that people who do things like donate kidneys, which is the group I know the most about empirically, are very sensitive to other people's fear, which seems to result from strong amygdala responses to other people's fear, which is probably some reflection of their own capacity for fear, because we think that is how people recognize emotions like fear. So they have this robust capacity for fear. They don't have anxiety disorders necessarily. Some do, I should say. And in fact, we have a couple we've worked with have needle phobias. They faint when they give blood and have still donated kidneys, right? They do something that most of us wouldn't do because it's too scary, right? That we don't want to give a kidney to a stranger because it's super scary. So what they're doing, it's not that they're fearless, it's that they're brave. They are overriding their fear response to help somebody else. So how?
Right.
So there was this amazing study that came out in rats earlier this year by somebody called Rickenbacker that showed that oxytocin receptors in the amygdala are what compel mother rats to leap into action to protect their babies from threat rather than freezing. So a mother rat under threat, so you train her to fear the smell of peppermint oil. And then you pipe peppermint oil into a cage. And the normal response is a fear response. You freeze.
Yeah.
But if the mother has pups in the cage with her, she overrides that freezing response with care. She, depending on the age of the pup, she either goes to them and protects them, puts her body over them, or she tries to plug up the tube with sawdust. She's altruistic, right? Trying to help her pups. And if you block oxytocin receptors, you get rid of that response, and then they manage to also trace it to the amygdala. What oxytocin seems to be able to do is preserve the subjective experience of fear, certainly the physiological fear response.
Like alarm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll get intact sort of hypothalamic-driven physiology, fear physiology.
HPA. Kind of stuff.
Which explains why you can still recognize fear, maybe even better.
Yeah.
Oxytocin might even amplify that response.
Right.
Because if you've got oxytocin, you can simulate that threat even better.
Right.
But what it also does is it inhibits fear behavior, so including things like freezing and avoidance. And so it allows you to recognize that somebody's feeling fearful because you can still experience that state, you can still simulate that state, but it somehow shifts you away from defensive behavior toward protective behavior.
So, because it also hijacks dopamine, right?
And it does it through the dopamine system.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's going to potentiate all these dopaminergic responses through nucleus accumbens.
Yeah, I think of it like a switching station in a rail yard, where it's like away from PAG mediated freezing and toward striatally mediated active care. I think that's I would put money on the fact that that's what's happening.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
This is elegant.
Thank you.
And I love it also because I want to totally geek out a little bit with some of get into the weeds a little bit at this point, because when I think about caregiving behavior, I think about nucleus accumbens a lot, nucleus accumbens shell, medial preoptic area, hypothalamus, you know, where a lot of that oxytocin is synthesized, and it's all sort of pushing out into regions like amygdala, also medial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, and these kinds of things. Do you imagine sort of expanding, you know, ways in which the future of your research program is going to kind of expand beyond amygdala to sort of bring in some of these other systems?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you know, if imaging the amygdala is hard and all its complexity, imaging, you know, hypothalamus and some of these other regions is even harder.
It's murder.
And so
we
you
can't
really,
we actually put spheroids down.
Yeah.
We can't even.
Yeah, I mean, it's
like all you can do.
And of course, we know that there's all this incredible complexity within hypothalamus. So if you're imaging the whole structure, I mean, who knows what you're finding? And so, and of course, we can't look at receptors in using fMRI, and using PET, we can only look at certain neurotransmitters, and oxytocin is not among them. And I know that there are people who are looking for ligands to measure oxytocin receptor activity, and when we can do that, we can answer my question, but we can't do it yet. But with the rat work, but I feel like the rat work is so clear at this point that it still allows for a pretty good explanation.
The other thing that I'm really interested in, hearing what you said about bravery. So it's sort of funny kind of operational definition of bravery is that you have high fear and high, you know, caregiving intervention behavior. You know, the classic line, you know, bravery isn't the absence of fear at all, right? It's doing it despite.
Exactly.
Right?
That's exactly right.
But then, you know, sort of really operationalizing that at the we have this sort of oxytocin story, but it also seems like there's this potential self-control story, like this like prefrontally mediated sort of, you know, it's especially sort of lateral prefrontal cortex, you know, how we regulate affective responses to control our behavior. But that gets complicated too, it seems to me, because one of the things, I don't know if you know about Marco Iacoboni's work with TMS. So he's one of the things he finds is that when he actually sort of disrupts self-regulatory prefrontal cortex activity, people behave more altruistically.
Right. Well, that relates to Dave Rand's research
David
on
Rand, with the cognitive load.
Exactly.
And all
that
that
altruism
stuff.
is actually for most people that is the intuitive response.
So do you think that you know, you're sort of converging with these lines of research to suggest that people are
most people. And this is where it always comes in. It's like, for most people that's true. For a subset of people, it's definitely not true.
It's really great because I often feel compelled to like try and answer the question, are people intrinsically altruistic or intrinsically selfish? And your work, more than most, I think, more than most, is really going, there's a continuum.
Exactly.
You know,
that's why we have trouble answering this question. It's the wrong question.
It's the wrong question.
People vary. And it's why this, you know, are humans good or evil question has not been answered in the thousands of years people have been trying to answer it. It's because you can always find examples of people who do things that are truly good and truly evil. And that's because there's a continuum. Like there's a continuum for everything. It shouldn't be surprising.
Right. It shouldn't be, but it, because I want that answer, right? Oh, God.
Yeah. And it's hard, right? Because as a society, we want to know, like, what are people really? Because then we can just go forth into the world being trusting or untrusting and knowing it's the right answer. But as everybody who knew Ted Bundy could tell you, sometimes people who seem trustworthy are not.
But I still want to try and get you to answer the question in this one sort of probabilistic kind of way, right? So we talked about how there's this distribution, right? It's maybe a normal distribution. I don't know exactly what the distribution looks like. Do you have a good sense in the normal population?
It just depends on what measure you're using.
Yeah, I guess so. But
I will say that a lot of measures kind of boil down to this 2/3, 1/3.
That's where I was going.
Oh, really? Yeah.
That's exactly where I was going.
There's a lot of different studies, including some that Dave Rand have done and some on psychopathy that suggest that 2/3 of people are pretty good, and they may
pretty
act
altruistic.
Yeah, they certainly have the real capacity to care about other people.
Yes,
and will be selfless at least some of the time, with quite a bit of variation within them. But 2/3 of people can be pretty well trusted, and then there's another third of people who vary a lot also, but are probably less trustworthy and are much more often going to be out for themselves.
Yeah. Do you have, this is just ringing this bell for me that I haven't thought of in a long time, the old sort of game theory, hawk and dove,
exactly.
Do you think this maps onto that in any particular way?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the idea would be that you can't have too high a proportion of truly psychopathic people in the population, or cooperation falls apart,
right,
because they're not trustworthy.
Right. They'll be spotted, or there'll be an increase in wariness.
That's right. They can gain because they are out for themselves in the population only because they're rare. And if they were common, everybody would become so untrusting that cooperation would break down and we'd have no society.
Well, I could keep going all day, and I just want to thank you. This is always such a pleasure.
Of course, always.
So, Sage, I have to ask this, and I ask this of all my undergraduate students when I teach about Abby's work. Do you have 2 kidneys?
Yes, I do. I do have 2 kidneys.
You see where I'm going with this? Yeah. Why won't you give one of them up to someone who might die if they don't get one, who doesn't have one?
So I actually thought about this. I was born with renal reflux, so my ureter.
Yeah. So you've got an out.
So I have a little bit of an out. I don't have problems with my kidneys anymore.
Theoretically, with this condition, is there supposing you don't grow out of it, could you wind up needing a kidney, for example?
That's a really good question. If I didn't have access to antibiotics and had reflux, you could definitely sustain real damage to the kidneys if you just have perpetual infection.
So you occupy a very unique space as theoretically someone who could either donate a kidney or wind up needing a kidney.
Right. I have just a little bit of a traumatic relationship with health in my body.
Yeah.
I don't feel very bad about saying I'm going to keep both of my kidneys.
Yeah.
Whether that's actually medically warranted or not, right? Like, I am totally prepared for if a doctor looked at me and was like, "You're a fine candidate. Give me one of those." Well, I can accept that.
What comes up?
But I might not give them my kidney.
Right. In 10 years, I've had one student startle me by saying, "Yeah, I'm going to do that."
Wow.
And I don't know whether they did or not.
Right.
But they seemed confident and determined. So
something I wonder about is, like, do they grow up thinking, "Yeah, I'll give a kidney"? I think it's like a split-second thing that happens for them.
They Abby writes about this in her book, Fear Factor. They're watching the TV is the sort of canonical example. But here's another way in which people learn about someone else needing a kidney. It's your sibling.
Yeah.
And right away, across the class, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, I would totally do that." Maybe most of us wouldn't give our kidneys voluntarily to a total stranger, given all of the expense and risk and et cetera. But most of us maybe would for a close family member. Maybe there's some middle ground for a friend or an acquaintance. Maybe for some people, there's like, no, I'm not going to do that for anybody under any circumstance. That continuum has deeper meaning for me personally. It sort of suggests what Abby says, there being people with psychopathy rather than being psychopaths.
Yeah.
Right? And she really emphasizes that. And I think it's super important because our popular media, our entertainment, we like to think of psychopaths as psychopaths, like some kind of monster.
Yeah.
That's separate. But
yeah.
That's not, that hides a lot of ambiguity and unclarity and interesting questions about etiology. We talk about how sometimes people with psychopathic traits don't have any of the neural or genetic markers that are associated with psychopathy. They just had a terribly difficult childhood.
Right.
And vice versa. You see it vice versa.
Right.
There are probably degrees.
I think it's very human for people not engaging in this type of research to see psychopaths, as they are termed by the media, and really want to reject everything about it and say, I can't understand how any of this would come to be. And yeah, that's kind of the point. It's antisocial behavior. We're social creatures. It's stuff that that directly flies into the face of how, we're kind of programmed to cooperate.
Yeah. It seems to me that, if psychopaths are just monsters,
Right.
then I don't have to worry about my own antisocial tendencies to the extent that they are. We know that ordinary people in Nazi Germany and Rwanda did things that almost anybody would count as psychopathic, and that's deeply unsettling. It's comforting to other them.
Fear ends up being this really surprisingly key component in Abby's studies. And it's this emotion that totally connects psychopathy to altruism, in the sense that, like, if you can recognize fear in other people, that's the key to all of this.
This is why the title of her book is The Fear Factor. It is the through line. Fear is where basic emotion, psychopathy, and altruism research meet. She also brings to psychological and neuroscientific research the insight that these emotional expressions, like fear, they are root and branch signals. They're not just outputs of some internal state. They are signals that don't just offer information to the world, but literally that control behavior in others. That's what signals do in animals. The music of Circle of Willis is written and performed by Tom Stauffer and his band, The New Drakes. For more information on how to purchase their music, go to circleofwillispodcast.com.
You can also find all of our old episodes on the website. If you haven't already, subscribe to Circle of Willis wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more updates.
Circle of Willis, human stories of the science that shapes our world.